Thank you. Welcome everybody to our TMN Tuesday September event. This is our monthly advanced training webinar that we host for our Master Naturalists, and we have a returning speaker for our TMN Tuesday event this month. Before we get into the content of today's webinar, as always, we want to go through a quick tech check and our webinar etiquette. Tanya, even though that we've had this on here forever, this always reminds me of you. And so if you are new to our TMN Tuesday event, as an attendee, you cannot unmute or share your video, and that is on purpose. Sometimes on these events we have hundreds and thousands of attendees, and we want to make sure that we are giving our speaker the due attention that they deserve to be able to share that content with us today. But if you're seeing me get to this point of the presentation and you're going, I cannot hear you, you cannot hear me tell you to check your audio settings, but hopefully you can see the screen and the prompts that are directing you to go to your audio speaker and microphone settings. Adjust those, make sure that everything is plugged in and turned all the way up. So leaving that up for just one more second so those folks struggling can grab that real quick. All right, and I'll help those that are maybe still having issues in the chat. Speaking of chat, that is where you will ask questions today for our speaker. Michelle and I will moderate those questions for our speaker and ask them when available at the end of the webinar with time allotted. For that chat tool, we ask for everybody to be professional and respectful. Help us as moderators ask the questions that you intend by using your best spelling and grammar and avoiding acronyms so that we can get that question across as you intended it. Please make sure that that chat is to everyone so that we can all participate in the same discussion today. Last but not least, if this is again your first webinar and you are still experiencing issues, this is our help call center and our FAQ page. This is also linked on our TMN Tuesday website so that if you're still having issues, you can reach out and get those resources. All right, wrapping up our webinar etiquette for today's event, trying to not use as much time as possible to give it back to Tanya. As an attendee, you're not able to mute or share your video. That's intentional. Chat is for on-topic, professional, and respectful discussion only. If you are a master naturalist, you can count today's webinar as advanced training, either watch live or as a recording. Work with your local VMS admin to make sure that you're using the right descriptive on your VMS log. Again, we still have that WebEx help on our website if you're still experiencing issues.
So one thing I did notice today is we have a lot of new attendees or maybe new trainees who are have just started training in the fall of their local chapter with the Master Naturalist program. And one of the questions we have gotten repeatedly, probably this month, because of that is, can the TMN Tuesdays count as advanced training? And yes, they do. And this, the series, the Advanced Training TMN Tuesday series that our state office offers is recorded. It's always recorded and then made available on our website. And if you're not able to make the recording or the session live today, you can watch the recording for advanced training as well. In addition to today's recording, anything that's on our TMN Tuesday page as a recording for the year, our Master Naturalists can watch those recordings for advanced training and report them as advanced training as well. We do offer this series at the second Tuesday of every month. We are all the way into September now. We have 3 more coming up. October is a little bit of a change in weeks. So we have the first week of the month that in October to make the switch for our annual meeting, and there will be some presentations connected to our annual meeting in the project fair that's happening for that. So we welcome you to join us at any time for these advanced training events, the TMN Tuesdays. And they're also open beyond the Master Naturalist program. So Obviously, we offer these for our master naturalists and their advanced training component and needs, but anyone is welcome to attend and watch, tune in for the seminars as long as they are registered. If you are interested in helping us to continue to offer things like this through the program and through Texas Parks and Wildlife, we just ask that you share a little bit information about this event. It's completely voluntary, but if you're available to contribute to the survey, this little survey that we have today, you can hover over the QR code there, or we'll drop the survey link into the chat too, so you can take the survey there as well. So in advance, thank you for contributing to the survey for us. Another item related to advanced training, and we mentioned that these TMN Tuesdays are advanced training for our members. And another item that we have coming up, especially if you're new and you haven't heard about our Texas Master Naturalist annual meeting, is we do offer an annual meeting each year. This year's in a new and exciting location for us, McAllen in the Valley. And this is another opportunity for you to get all of your advanced training in one weekend for the entire year. So we have over 100 sessions that'll be taking place at the annual meeting. Some of those on site, a lot of those are field sessions. In all connected to the annual meeting. So, and our registration is open through the 29th of this month. So just a couple more weeks to get registered and go. And Mary Pearl's already dropped the chat to the annual meeting in there. And so without further ado, we want to introduce our speaker today. Tanya Homian is our state ornithologist with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And Tanya is no stranger to the Master Naturalist program. In her previous role with Texas Parks and Wildlife, many of you know her as the previous Texas Nature Checkers biologist, who would come to your chapter trainings and provide training on either iNaturalist, Texas Nature Tracker programs and projects, and then other specialties such as birds for your chapter and chapter training and advanced training events. But today we are eager and excited to welcome Tanya back as the state ornithologist, and her speaking on the topic of safer skies for birds today. Move it over to Tanya. All right, there you go.
Okay. Okay, so one last check. Can y'all see my first slide? All right, so let's jump on in. So just as a bit of a heads up, y'all, I am not going to be able to see, or I really am not going to be able to pay attention to what's happening in the chat. So please do feel free to leave questions and things like that, or just I may ask for a little audience feedback. So just drop that in the chat, and we'll circle back around to it.
Yeah, we'll moderate those for you too.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm very excited to be here, especially at this time of year, talking about this topic. Fall migration is upon us, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've been kind of involved in various ways with bird collisions for some time. So we're going to start by talking about the big picture of bird conservation and where collisions generally fits into that picture. We're going to then focus in a little bit on the biological factors, specifically about bird building collisions. So that's what we're going to focus in on today, and then talk a bit about the design factors that play into that. So there's really kind of two aspects we're going to focus in on today: glass and light. And then we're going to talk about strategies for mitigating collision with glass, and then also talk about strategies and programs for mitigating artificial light at night. So this is kind of fitting into a bigger picture of a long-term decline in bird populations for North America. And I do want to also say that many of our bird populations globally are in decline, and that collisions with buildings are not just something that's limited to North America. That's what we're going to focus in on today, but just know that there are researchers and groups out there around the world that are trying to address this issue as well. So what we know is that since we have really been able to do some very targeted monitoring on bird populations in the Americas, that we have lost nearly 3 billion birds from the North American landscape since 1970. That's nearly 1 in 4 birds gone. And we also know that, broadly speaking, there are declines that are taking place in birds that are associated with a variety of different native habitat types. The only exception to this is our wetland birds, and that is thanks to some very targeted and concerted efforts to recover and manage wetlands. So I want to kind of put that out there as a little bit of good news. If we build it, they will come back. So we have some work to do here. And then we have these various issues that contribute to bird declines. Probably the biggest overarching global challenge that birds face is habitat loss. They're also dealing in many cases with the impacts and the synergies that come with a changing climate, these big global massive issues. But then we have certain issues that are very directly related to actual human activities on the ground that are very kind of local and targeted. They may be widespread, but these are things that are direct human impacts. And so we're going to focus in on one of those today, collisions. So one of the big questions we often get, people will ask a lot of questions about wind turbines. And again, a lot of these are going to be estimates. We don't have really solid numbers for a lot of these different factors that are out on the landscape. There isn't necessarily very organized or concerted or required monitoring. So this is an industry that's rapidly taking off. We estimate that maybe at this point, upwards of 1.17 million birds, maybe fatalities annually at wind turbines. But the number is usually cited as in the hundreds of millions, or in the, hundreds of thousands of birds. So we also know that we have risk from communication towers. This is usually about 6.6 million or so birds annually killed by contact with those. Power lines are often cited as being responsible for about 22.8 million bird fatalities annually. But when it comes to collisions, the big thing that's out there are buildings in terms of taking out the largest number of birds that we know of. In this case, we're talking about numbers that are pushing nearly 1 billion birds. So the estimates run anywhere from 365 to 988 million birds killed annually. And it is the #2 cause of direct human-related mortality to birds in the United States. So many of you can probably guess, if you want to put it in the chat, what the #1 direct human-related cause of death to birds is. And yep, I'm seeing it pop up there. You were right, feral and free-roaming cats. And that's by, we're talking close to almost 3.8 billion birds estimated taken by cats. But we're going to talk about building collisions today. So we have this issue that takes place in a landscape that is filled with birds that are constantly on the move. Roughly 70% of North America's bird species migrate, and roughly 80% of those migrate at night. So when we're talking about the built landscape and nocturnal migrants, we often have a challenge with light pollution. And what's happening in this case is that it can draw birds into urban areas where they wouldn't necessarily normally be. Birds can also become attracted to or trapped in beams of light. And again, it's very timely. I always have this slide when I talk about this topic, but again, given the date that we are today, yesterday being the anniversary of 9/11, this is actually an image from the World Trade Center tribute in light. And what you can see in those beams of light, each one of those specks is a bird that is trapped in those beams. So basically, it's the same effect as if you're a driver and somebody, you know, when you're driving along, you get kind of a full face of high beams. You can quickly, you know, become disoriented and lose your spatial sense of where you are. So that's kind of an acute issue. The kind of cool win-win story to this, there's a lot of kind of, I guess, things that we need to be concerned about, challenges, but there are a lot of conservation wins out there. And I always wanted to stay focused on that and look for the solutions. So New York City Audubon noticed that this was happening and talked to the operators of the Tribute in Light and said, hey, we noticed we've got this problem. We're seeing a lot of birds that are getting trapped in these beams of light. What often happens is they fly around in circles until they become exhausted and then eventually end up grounded. Some of them may be in very poor body shape. Some of them may not survive. So what the agreement was is that people, bird watchers, would post themselves in various places and watch when the lights were on to see when they hit kind of an agreed upon critical mass of birds in the lights. Radio down to the operators and ask them to switch the lights off, and then basically watch for the birds to disperse and give the all clear to turn it back on. But broadly speaking, what's happening with a lot of this broad-based light pollution, the sky glow and the things that we can see from miles away, is that it can actually act as a beacon and draw birds into these urban areas where they're at greater risk of collision with buildings. So one of the things that we know too is that certain types of birds tend to be, just based on their biology, more prone to collision with buildings. So a lot of our songbirds tend to fly at lower altitudes than many, for example, of our waterfowl do, which puts them in kind of that high risk zone. There's also really close down to the ground, a zone where you tend to have even higher risk of collisions happening during the daytime. So we also know, based on the data that have been collected from collision monitoring, is that urban and exotic bird species are rarely window strike fatalities. Sometimes it may happen, especially if you have predators in the area, especially things like Cooper's hawks or peregrine falcons that may be chasing some of these birds. And in some cases, they may, as they're trying to evade a predator, fly into a window. But typically, if we have things that are collision issues with many of these types of birds in urban areas, it's often collision with vehicles, getting hit by a car as they're flying across the road. We also know that migratory birds tend to be at greater risk of collision with buildings than the bird species that are resident, that don't migrate. That said, though, nearly 33% of our native species have been recorded at some point as victims of window strikes. And many of these are birds that we know well from perhaps migration, like Nashville or Tennessee warbler, some that we know as overwintering species, like for us here in Texas, like white-throated sparrow or dark-eyed junco, and even birds that breed here, like painted bunting. So there are some life history factors that seem to pose perhaps a greater risk for some of these birds. We tend to find more insectivorous species, species that inhabit forests and woodlands represented in collision fatalities, more nocturnal migrants than diurnal migrants, and there are some taxa that are disproportionately vulnerable to collisions. They seem to be represented in collision monitoring more perhaps than their abundance on the landscape would otherwise suggest. And we may colloquially refer to these as super colliders. The ovenbird is a great example. So we're home here in Texas to over 660 bird species. Over 98% of all neotropical or long-distance migrant bird species in North America have at some point been documented in Texas. So we have a real management responsibility for our migrating birds. We also have a rapidly changing landscape. So more than 85% of our population now lives in or around one of our major metropolitan areas. Our overall state population is predicted to nearly double by 2050. And we're host to two emerging megaregions. So we have this one that goes between Dallas, Fort Worth, down to Houston, over to San Antonio, and up through Austin, Round Rock, called the Texas Triangle. So this area is predicted to grow about 93% and host 70% of the state's population by 2050. We also have another one that extends all the way from Brownsville over to the panhandle of Florida that collectively is called the Gulf Coast megaregion. That's expected to grow in totality by about 76% by 2050. And the reason that these classifications as megaregions matter is because of the way that they're connected by commerce and culture and growth. There's a lot of things that are happening in those shaded areas that aren't necessarily clustered directly around the cities. So a great example that we've been watching for the last couple of decades is the rapid growth that's happening, for example, along the I-35 corridor. Many of you are probably witnessing it firsthand. So that's kind of one of those areas where there's a lot of that growth that's happening in those in-between spaces. And again, all of that brings with it more built environment and more light at night. So, excuse me, this is a map basically taken of the state of Texas, looking at the light output adjusted for population and what's basically being projected up into the sky. So you'll also notice a little representation here from some of our industry, not just directly coming from urban development, but in areas that are actually less developed. We've got a lot of light that you can see in areas that's actually coming from oil and gas industry. So why this artificial light at night matters is, again, we talked about what this can do to birds. We're right there, this central flyway gateway, the first and last place that birds stop before they cross over the Gulf of Mexico. And we host 3 cities considered to be highest risk in the United States to migrating birds due to artificial light at night. So San Antonio came in number 10 for spring migration. Dallas came in number 3 for both spring and fall migration. And Houston came in number 2, highest risk to birds in the United States for spring and fall migration. Does anybody have any guesses in the chat about which city in this study, which was done in 2019, came in at number 1? Feel free to drop those in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing a few guesses. Nope, so far no. No. We have a winner. I saw it flash up there. Chicago is actually the number 1 risk for migrating birds because of the light and also because of their particular location where they're situated on the Great Lakes. So that said, we got 3 cities. We got work to do. So going back to that 3 billion bird study, one of the things that the authors wanted to do was not just simply say, well, we got a problem, folks. They also wanted to put solutions out there. And so as part of their outreach, this is one of the graphics that they put out there to basically give people some options for ways that they can take action to make our environment safer for birds. And one of those is making windows safer. So let's dive into some of the design issues and talk about glass and light. We'll start with glass. So one of the biggest challenges I think that we often have when we talk about this issue is thinking about how we as humans see the built landscape versus how other organisms perceive it. And the kind of blunt answer to that is we really truly don't know what a bird perceives. We can't see like a bird. We can't process the world like a bird. Their vision is rather different than ours. But we can think about the things that we take for granted. So when we look at this picture, we see brick walls, we see framing, metal framing, and we see what, to most of us, we probably automatically assume that there are panes of glass in this window and they are reflecting trees. A bird will not necessarily perceive that. There's a very high likelihood that a bird will look at that gap, that void, those square shapes, and say, there's habitat there, I'm going to fly towards it. So the reflectivity of glass is a major challenge we deal with. The other thing that we're dealing with that's a property of glass when the light changes is the invisibility of glass. And so this is a situation where you don't have anything reflected and it simply looks like a void into which a bird can fly. So some of the research that's out there has kind of assessed what's happening with some of the ways that we use glass on buildings. So the proportion and the total amount of glass make a difference. For every 10% increase in the glass that's used on a building facade, collision mortality increases roughly 19% in spring migration and roughly 32% in the fall. Now, when we look at light, as light emissions increase, the number of fatal bird collisions also increases, and the number of birds that are trapped in the light increases. So brighter light, not so good. And then as we put these two together, as the proportion of glass lighted at night increases, we also see the number of fatal bird collisions increase. And these are things that we use together. We tend to use glass and light in conjunction very closely. So the thing that a lot of us picture when we picture buildings that pose a risk to birds is we often just immediately have this picture in our mind of a skyscraper that's completely just solid glass shining there on the landscape, a big scary beacon. But we don't have a whole lot of those buildings collectively on the landscape. The things that actually cumulatively pose a greater threat to birds, because there are just so many more of them, are the things that are actually lower story. So residential buildings that are roughly 1 to 3 stories account for about 44% of mortality in the United States. Low-rise buildings that are 4 to 11 stories account for 56% of mortality, and those high-rise buildings over 12 stories, only about 1% of mortality. In Canada, the numbers are even a little bit different. 90% of their collisions come from residential, 9% from low-rise, and only about 1% still from high-rise buildings. So again, we can't necessarily personally do a whole lot about a high-rise. We can talk to building managers, but every single one of us, day in, day out, we interact with a lot of these residential class or low-rise buildings and can potentially take some action. So on these buildings, we tend to see a lot of collisions that are often more clustered at ground level stories, largely because of how we use glass on buildings. There tends to be more glass, there tends to be more clear glass, and again, with the way we use landscaping, there tends to be more reflected habitat or sky, and sometimes we even have indoor plants and things like atriums that are potential attractant and can draw birds into those areas. So that said, some buildings do cause disproportionately more collisions than others. So this is the US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis that was built a few years ago. And there were attempts to get the building designed and constructed with more bird-friendly materials and design. And what you see is what was built. And so there was a study that was done in Minneapolis, including this building, plus 20 additional downtown buildings ranging from 2 to 57 stories, various uses. And they monitored this collection of buildings for 4 migration seasons, for two years, basically. And what they found when they went in and analyzed all of the results was that this stadium plus 3 high-rises accounted for 74% of the fatal collisions. So in some cases, we can have these very, very impactful buildings that may be worth a lot of our attention to try and do some mitigation. So we've actually seen our own share of some of this type of phenomenon. Sometimes the conditions are just right, or if you will, just wrong for migrating birds, and we can have these really catastrophic collision events like what happened on Galveston in 2017 during spring migration. So this was a 23-story building. There was a storm overnight with high winds, and people first thing in the morning immediately noticed a large number of birds around the bottom of this building. Galveston Animal Control was called to come and assess the situation. And by the time they were done, they collected 395 dead birds representing 25 different species. Most of the birds that were found were deceased. Only 3 individual birds were in a position to be able to be taken to a rehabilitator. So just a note, that 395 number is very, very likely an undercount. One of the things that researchers investigate as they're looking at collision monitoring is the natural phenomenon that you will often have scavengers come in and remove carcasses before the human monitors can find them. So the numbers vary pretty widely about what that number is. There is no magic number. It really seems to vary, but you can be looking sometimes 10%. Sometimes there's at least one study I found where up to 33% of carcasses were never in a study that was an experiment that were recovered. So that's very likely an undercount. So again, you may have had a particular image in your mind of this building, and this is the building. So this is a great example about what the danger can be from light. So you look at this and you're not seeing a whole lot of giant panes of glass. Those windows seem to be kind of recessed into the concrete facade, but it is a white concrete facade, and the risk factor here was this very bright uplighting to illuminate the whole building. So you can imagine if you had a lot of clouds, if you had a lot of rain, high winds, how this would turn into a white glow and potentially attract birds to their doom. So the picture that you see on the right is what the building looks like after a lights out regimen. So nobody wants to have this happen on their building. The building operators worked with Houston Audubon to basically assess the situation and come up with a plan and implement a lights out strategy. So you can see there's still safety lighting on the building, but that problematic uplighting has been turned off. But that gets us into this bigger kind of question and discussion about light pollution. So what is light pollution? What's going on here? Basically, we can describe it as the adverse effect of artificial light at night. And there's a variety of different components to light pollution. So we have light trespass, which is nuisance light from poorly directed or unshielded light, so it's just going everywhere. That can contribute to this overall phenomenon called sky glow. We all know sky glow. We've all seen sky glow in the distance. Even when you're, you got to get pretty far out into the remote areas of the state to avoid seeing sky glow. One of my favorite terms that's out there is light clutter. I'm not a fan of clutter in general, and I really don't like light clutter. Basically, it comes from poor design, where the philosophy is all the lights are so much better, and there's too much light, and it just is excessive. What that can result in is a phenomenon called glare, which is basically where you have horizontal light that is shining in the face of the person who's supposed to be benefiting from the light, and it actually compromises safety and security because it's impeding your vision. So generally speaking, with a typical light installation, only about 40 to 50% of the light that's out there is considered to be useful. 10% generally is about, contributes to glare, but then a lot of that light, 35 to 50%, can be contributing to sky glow. So again, we have a lot of opportunity to be able to do things better. So backing up to the big picture of bird migration and thinking about the world that we've created. If you're a bird that's migrating from South America to your breeding grounds in the boreal forest, and then you have to make that journey again in the fall all the way back south, this is the landscape that you have to navigate. So you're really going through a gauntlet of light. We estimate that about 10% of the planet's land area is subject to artificial light at night, and an even larger amount, about 23%, subject to sky glow. So this is really a very large scale issue that birds have to deal with. And it's not just birds. We know that artificial light at night can change melatonin levels and impact reproductive cycles in mammals. It can impact crop yield and phenology in plants. It can change reproduction, predation, foraging, and other behaviors in amphibians and reptiles. A great example is when hatchling sea turtles try to go towards a city rather than out to sea as they should be because they're drawn to the artificial light. We know that with insects, it can change, again, behavior, reproduction, pollination, predator avoidance, and with birds, a lot of different things. It can change nesting behavior, singing behavior, foraging, and then as we've discussed, it can interfere with migration and navigation. So in case those arguments are not compelling enough, artificial light at night has potential impacts to humans as well. So it's been linked to everything from disrupted sleep to long-term health consequences such as heart disease, cancer, and suppression of the immune system. There's a lot of motivation to get this right. And a lot of people will push back and say, okay, but what about safety? I need light to feel safe. And I think the key takeaway from a lot of this is nobody's telling you you can't have light. We're just asking you to use light in a smarter way. So I love this picture, this couple of pictures, because it really demonstrates how bad lighting design can actually be a detriment to your safety. So you have a lot of glare, the light shining in the face of the viewer here. You can't really clearly see that there's a person in that gate. When you shield that light and create a much more ambient glow, you're able then to actually perceive more of what's happening in your surroundings than you would with this big glowing ball of light. So we can use lighting to create spaces that are safe for people, but that also respect the rest of the environment and everybody who wants to get a good night's sleep. So let's shift gears and talk about design strategies. So those are the issues. Glass, light, what do we do about it? So let's start with glass. So the gold standard, what we really want to be trying to do is getting in the design level. We want to try and think about these factors as we're creating buildings, as we're sketching out what those blueprints are going to look like. And really what it comes down to with glass is finding ways to reduce the reflectivity of glass, increase the visibility of glass, and reduce what we call design traps. And we'll talk about a few of those that, again, are things that humans perceive, and we don't question it because we understand intuitively that there's a barrier there. But if we design things poorly, we may be setting up a situation where a bird thinks that it can actually pass through a barrier that it doesn't necessarily perceive. So one of the exciting things is that for some years now, there has been an innovation credit that was piloted for the LEED certification for bird collision deterrence. It was actually moved to the permanent Library of Innovation credits in 2022. And interestingly enough, it was the most used pilot credit in LEED history. So this credit is based on a variety of research that looks at and tries to assess and put ratings to different materials that can be used on the facade of a building. And basically, when you build and plan the building, you get a credit calculated based on the relative threat level for each of those different facades that you've used on the building. So that's how this works. So there's some really kind of beautiful and innovative and simple techniques to really make buildings more bird friendly. So one of the easiest things to do is to use fritted or opaque glass. It's basically where you put kind of a frosting onto the glass surface itself that basically renders the glass visible to everybody, including birds. So this really fascinating building here is from New York City. It is the IAAC headquarters. It's designed by architect Frank Gehry, and it wasn't necessarily designed specifically to be bird friendly, but the artistic use of this opaque and fritted glass has that result. So New York City Audubon actually did monitoring around this building, and after 2 years of monitoring, did not record any collisions on this particular facility. So you don't have to necessarily do an entire building this way. You can target some of your potentially problematic areas using etched patterns or frosted finishes. And these can be patterns, these can be very simple. But again, anywhere where there's a potential to make that glass more visible. It's a controversial look, perhaps, maybe takes us back a few decades, but textured glass block. There are some definite uses for it. It's also, again, there are some people who may cringe when they see this, but it definitely is visible to birds. It is very much its own kind of look. So when we come back to this idea of frosting and ceramic fritting, I think sometimes we may look at a building like the IAAC building and say, oh, wow, that's a lot. Can I have a little bit of a view through the glass? And the answer is actually yes. You don't have to go 100% coverage on the surface of the glass. So the research that's been looking at this by American Bird Conservancy has found that even just having coverage on 20% of the glass surface, as long as it is fairly uniform and meets certain spacing criteria, you can reduce collisions by more than 90%. So things like shutters and louvers, you're not even modifying the glass. This is a kind of additional design feature on a building. These can be very useful in preventing collisions. And then cladding things that we normally would make plain glass. This picture, I actually had somebody slow down the car so I could lean out the window and take a picture of this in Houston. This is actually a sky bridge for the Houston Ballet. And instead of having it be clear glass, this was intended more for the privacy of the people using the sky bridge, but you can see this metal cladding makes it very, very clearly visible to birds. Sky bridges are another design factor that can often be very deadly to birds that are flying through these spaces because you've just got generally this clear tunnel of glass. But we can also take advantage of the differences between the biology of human vision versus bird vision. So what we see is very different from what a bird potentially sees because it can actually see into the UV spectrum. So there are manufacturers who have taken advantage of that and created glass that is custom designed with patterning on it that is UV, basically UV visible. So in theory, you use this and birds are able to, as the light hits it right, perceive that there is something there. And in theory, humans should not be able to perceive it at all. That said, this is one of those solutions that tends to be a little bit more custom, a little bit more expensive, and tends to be built into design at the ground level. So there's a lot of discussion around places like nature centers or museums or zoos where this kind of thing would be a really great solution because the primary mission of that group is to encourage nature viewing with an unimpeded view. So something like this, as they're planning new exhibits, might be within their budget to be able to do. A little harder perhaps for a homeowner. So we talked about design traps. So glass corners, you've seen a few of these buildings that we looked at pictures of where you have two corners of glass that are meeting. This is a great example of something that can create what's called a pass-through effect, where if the light is shining or not shining just right, a bird may not perceive that there's a barrier there and attempt to fly through. So thinking about how we design spaces like this, how we use glass in instances like this is going to be a good way to try and minimize the risk to birds. Also thinking about how we use glass in conjunction with landscape design elements. So this is a good example here. You can see these buildings on what's presumably an office building are highly, highly reflective and right next to a bunch of landscaping. And that reflection there is very clear, even in the photograph, could potentially be an attractant to birds that may perceive it as specifically habitat they can approach. So design is awesome. Architecture is awesome. What's also been fabulous is to hear just how many people in the architecture world are excited about tackling this challenge and bringing it into the work that they do in the design. But the just flat reality of it is that we got a lot of buildings out there and a lot of them we're going to be in a position to be doing retrofitting. So retrofitting existing problem glass is where probably most of us are at. So the good news is there's been research that makes suggestions about how we can do some retrofits on glass to make it more visible to birds. So one of the kind of quick and easy ways to think about this if you're applying a some kind of a marker on the exterior of a window is you want to be aiming for spacing that is roughly 2 by 4. So hold your hand in front of you and think about, if you had a small hand, no more than 2 inches of vertical space and no more than 4 inches of horizontal space. And if you think about the way that a bird flies, this probably makes a bit more intuitive sense if you picture that. Now that said, if you're having collision problems with smaller birds, things like kinglets or hummingbirds, take that down to 2 by 2. So you're really going to need to get a tight spacing on your pattern to potentially try and provide more of a discouragement for them to attempt to fly through. So this is there's a lot going on in this picture. The story behind this is my old office at Dogwood Canyon Audubon Center. And we're looking at it here in summer, but during the winter, prior to this picture being taken, we had an eruption of pine siskins, which is great. Everyone loves to see birds coming up to the building and to these feeders that were out there. But the problem is we also had a very happy and enthusiastic Cooper's hawk that had discovered this large congregation of small birds and had figured out that if it charged the feeders, it could scatter the birds, they'd go everywhere, and a lot of them would end up crashing into my window and end up disoriented and easy prey. So it only took a few days of this before I said, that's enough. I'm also not getting any work done with this situation. Let's fix this. So with the help of some fantastic volunteers, we got this ABC Bird Safe tape up on the outside of the window, the window that was assessed as the problem. That immediately stopped the problem, but I came in one morning and lo and behold, the window we hadn't treated had this lovely bird print on it. Someone had decided to fly towards the other pane. So a couple of takeaways on that. Again, I want to stress mitigation can work when it's done right, but you may have to go back and adjust as you start to see additional challenges and problems like this. So that said, let's think back to the biology of those birds that are often at highest risk. They're insectivorous. They're used to chasing their prey in many cases. They are also woodland or forest birds. They tend to be very agile and fly through small spaces. And so 3 decals on a window like this, not a challenge at all. And as you can see, somebody decided that, yes, in fact, they were going to try and fly into a space where there were no decals. So this is often the thing that people complain about when they talk about using decals is, well, I put decals up on my window and birds still flew into it. Spacing is key. You've got to get that coverage on that problem window to really put something perceptible there that birds will take notice of and perhaps think twice before they attempt to fly through it. So netting or screening is another option. This is actually a photo taken from Rose Sanctuary up in Nebraska. And I had to really work to get my camera to focus on this netting. So talking with the staff there several years ago, asked them basically how this kind of fit in with their larger mission of giving people a space to observe these birds that are congregating on the Platte River as they're migrating. And they generally said they had no complaints. People understood why it was there, and the equipment that they were using, whether binoculars or scopes or cameras, was able to see past this netting and not create an observation problem. You can do this in a much more subtle way as well. So big thank you to Jane Tillman down here in Central Texas for sharing this photo. This is a solution that she installed in front of a couple of picture windows using monofilament and string. And so you can actually see here how these are anchored, which makes them very easy to take down if you need to clean the window, and seems to be a solution that is working to prevent collisions. There's a lot of aftermarket window films that are out there as well that you can take advantage of, variety of different vendors. And I can, at the end, I'm going to have a couple of links to resources, including American Bird Conservancy's glass collision page. So if you're curious about any of these products, that is your one-stop shop to go get some information about some of the various vendors and products that are out there. So one of the questions we often get is about feeders. And what do we do with bird feeders? Because you're drawing birds into space, and we tend to put feeders in front of windows because we generally want to be able to watch birds from inside. So there's a study that's often cited that discusses the takeaway from that being keeps feeders either very close to windows, where they're within 3 feet of windows, so that basically the flight speed of the bird as it's approaching or taking off is much slower and less likely then to create a dangerous situation if they do bump against the window, or really putting those feeders far, far away from windows, more than 30 feet away. So one of the caveats that came up in a discussion on the listserv about this was that the study was not intended to say 30 feet is your magic number. The study ended at 30 feet. And so the really safe number may be much higher than 30 feet. So the better rule of thumb is to say, keep them very, very, very close to windows, or as far away from those windows as you possibly can. Go 30 feet or more away. So again, we don't even have to be necessarily talking about things that are permanent on a window. Just simply hanging artwork in windows or painting artwork on the outside of a window. It can be just as useful and just as effective. And we do know, again, mitigation can be very effective. And the more studies we have discussing this can be very powerful argument to motivate buildings perhaps to take action on this issue. Nobody likes to be inside of a building where they're hearing thuds and finding dead birds. So this is a building in Portland. And very quickly after it was occupied, occupants started noticing a lot of collisions happening. So Audubon Portland monitored this and found a minimum estimate of about 125 collisions per year. And so the solution then was to do a full retrofit with horizontal patterned window film. So this is the before, and then you can see this here as the after. So again, very, very subtle, thin lines. Maybe from the outside, it looks like there's mini blinds there. But what they found is that post-treatment, when they continued to monitor, collisions are reduced by 94%. So again, it can be very, very effective. So if you know anybody who's in design or planning or architecture, or you're just curious to learn more about this issue, I would highly recommend that you seek out any number of these different bird-friendly development guidelines, bird-friendly standards. There's a lot of groups that have them out there. And again, you'll be able to find a lot of these through the resources on American Bird Conservancy's page. So let's switch a little bit and talk about mitigating artificial light at night. So there's a lot of what we refer to as lights out programs that are active around the United States. And generally what a lot of these take as a kind of point of action is turning off unnecessary lighting. So turning off exterior building lighting, turning off interior lights that are not in use, especially if you're close to the top floors of a building, installing timers or motion sensors so that light is only activated and used when it's needed. And then also thinking about color temperature and how we use that. So as we've moved into this brave new world of LED bulbs, you have so many different choices. And so you probably noticed that some of them tend to be a bit more blue. They measure that in kelvins. And so those are the ones that tend to be higher Kelvin. So 4,000, 5,000 tends to get you into more of the blue light. And then as you go down and you get into 2,800 to 3,000, you tend to be in what's called more of the warm white. So the things that we traditionally associate with light bulbs, in the incandescent light bulbs that we would use. So generally try and stay away from those blue wavelength bulbs where you can. Also not super great for people's bodies to be exposed to those at night, the blue wavelengths. So if you do need to use essential lighting like security or safety lighting, try and shield those lights, aim them downwards wherever possible, use task lighting rather than lighting up a full room if at all possible, draw blinds if you have them, or curtains on a window, close those off to avoid some of that light trespass, and dim or turn off lobby or atrium lighting where possible. So another thing that we often deal with that's kind of part of the larger context of the built landscape, but not necessarily directly connected to buildings themselves, searchlights and spotlights. So these can be very problematic during migration. So the best practice is to just simply try and not be using them at all, especially during those times of year. Another thing we often don't necessarily think about is how we use lighting in landscaping. So we are big fans of shining light up into trees. It makes for a very aesthetically pleasing view at night, but it is something that is contributing to light pollution. So perhaps think twice about how we use those lights shining up into trees. So this is all very exciting and very great, and we can have a city like Chicago go from lights on to lights off and all these buildings participating, and that's awesome. But we still have this bigger issue that we're dealing with sky glow. And so this gets us to this really gold standard of where we want to be going, which is to try and get large scale planning and practices that really target reducing light pollution that are aligned with dark skies initiatives. So thinking about better light design that's capped, shielded, or cut off to really direct the light where we need it, using appropriate bulbs and amount of lighting. So using those warm color temperatures and only using as much light as is necessary. And then these practices that are associated with creating a darker sky. So using timers and motion sensors rather than just having lights on all the time, and then creating lighting zones to really, again, focus the light where it's most needed. So again, no one is saying don't use light. We're asking for light to be used in a smarter, more strategic way. And if you are in a position where perhaps you live in an HOA that is looking at retrofitting or replacing some of their aging lighting, or you have contact with planning districts, or you're simply looking at upgrading some of what you have around the exterior of your own home, there's a lot of fantastic guidance out there from light pollution advisory groups and dark skies groups that can give you some guidance as to light fixture designs that are more problematic and light fixture designs that tend to be better for really reducing light pollution. So that said, that's the taking action with the lights off, but there's also kind of another piece to this that ties in with monitoring and seeing what's actually happening with the birds. So many of you have probably, hopefully at this point, heard about the Lights Out Texas program. This was started in 2021. A variety of different partners came together to make this happen. And one of the really exciting pieces was the contribution from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and their birdcast technology. So if you've seen any of these on social media, you may have seen some of these announcements that are actually targeted to specific conditions and predictions about when migratory activity is predicted to be very high. So this is some exciting stuff. I strongly encourage you guys to go do a little bit of a deep dive into birdcast and some of what goes into making these maps and these models. Very, very neat. But it can help us be more targeted in how we take action. So maybe if doing this every single night for a couple of months is too much, maybe you can be watching out for these birdcast alerts to really know when your actions are going to have a bigger impact. So generally speaking, we're talking about taking action during spring migration and fall migration. So broadly, this runs in Texas from early March to mid-June for spring, with a peak between mid-April and early May. And right now, we're in fall migration. So that started roughly mid-August for a lot of species. Will run through late November with a peak from early September to late October. So we're there, we're in it. And we're asking for non-essential lighting to be turned off from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. So if you're interested in getting connected or learning more about the Lights Out Texas initiative, as of spring 2023, Audubon Texas is the steward of this program now, and they have a lot of really great resources and information for getting involved. Also some really great recaps of the great work that's been done to date. Some highlights, last spring, we saw 20 Lights Out proclamations across the state, 25 commercial pledges across the state to go lights out, and also some amazing contributions from volunteers across the state who were trained on a particular protocol and are contributing data to a particular project that looks at set urban routes, monitoring particular buildings. So we had 125 volunteers contribute nearly 1,400 volunteer hours and 3 new programs launched this last spring. So excited to see what happens going into the fall. So I mentioned there was a particular project for this initiative, and it's on iNaturalist. So if you're curious to check that out, you can search for Lights Out Texas Monitoring and look for this page right there. So one thing to also note, in addition to taking data on the birds that are found, we have permits set up for these teams who have particular designated individuals who are permitted to basically carry those specimens and take them to their final destination at the Biodiversity Research and Teaching Collections at Texas A&M University. And there, those specimens are being cataloged, they're being verified with their identifications, and to date, they have taken in nearly 2,000 bird specimens since monitoring began in 2020. So where do things stand right now with collision casualties? So what we have from our Lights Out Texas monitoring project, these are the top 10 species that had been recorded so far since monitoring began in spring 2021. And you can see here, we have our number one most commonly recorded species is the ovenbird, our super collider. We also have white-throated sparrow, Lincoln sparrow, a couple of different warblers in here. So it's an interesting collection, and I think perhaps a little bit more reflective too of where we fit in the central flyway with a lot of grasslands. We have grasshopper sparrow and our Lincoln sparrow in there as well. So that said, if you are interested in contributing collision data that's not associated with this particular initiative, maybe you're at home, maybe you're out somewhere else or at work and you see a collision happen, you can contribute to several other different projects. There's a very large scale window collision project on iNaturalist. There are some more targeted ones for Central Texas, for Austin itself, and even ones that are associated with particular locations like college campuses. So an example here, UT's San Antonio has their own project, and a lot of other universities do as well, more than can fit on one slide. So this is a lot. We looked at a lot of pictures of dead birds, and that's kind of what you do when you work in the topic of collisions. But there's a lot of amazing people out there who do some fantastic work, and they still manage to do it with kind of a dry sense of humor. So this little story, this coffee cup, comes to us from a meeting that we had in the city of Minneapolis many years ago, with different partners coming together. And we noticed one of the participants during a bit of a break was scribbling on her coffee sleeve. And we were like, hey, what are you doing? She said, oh, I'm just spreading the good word about, bird-friendly buildings. And so we looked, and the quote was from Oprah Winfrey. It said, know what sparks the light in you, then use that light to illuminate the world. And she had modified it to say, know what sparks the light in you, then turn that light out at 11 p.m. during migration. So big kudos to all the various people who work and to this bird-friendly messaging here, even something as simple as a coffee cup by Judy Pollock, who was at the time with the Audubon Chicago region. So that said, there are so many different organizations, individuals, groups that have contributed to what we know about this topic. They cannot all fit on even multiple slides, but these are some of the groups that have done a lot of work on behalf of this topic. There are also countless universities in North America, in South America, in Central America, and all over the world that have been diligently working on researching the science and the solutions of collisions. And so to them, I give a huge, huge thank you. So that said, I'm going to leave this up here on the screen for a couple of minutes. Many of you may have questions about where you can learn more about this issue, where you can find resources about not just the design planning guides, where you can find solutions, where you can find particular aftermarket or items that are available commercially for being able to retrofit glass. So your one-stop shop is American Bird Conservancy's Glass Collisions website. So you should be able to scan that QR code and get to that. And then closer to home, if you're interested in the Lights Out Texas initiative, Audubon Texas has great resources available on their website as well. And so that is your second QR code and link right there. And so I will leave these up for a couple more minutes, but again, this will be recorded. So you'll be able to get back to these, because right before we go into Q&A, I want to put this up and leave this up as we do some Q&A. So thank you to Texas Conservation Alliance for sharing this with me. If you're interested in getting involved with on-the-ground bird window collisions in these different cities, here are your contacts. Screenshot this or take a picture of it, and please do consider getting involved with this work. There's some real impact that you can have out there for bird conservation. So that said, that's what I had. And so if we have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer some of them now.
Hey, Tanya, we had a couple questions that came through as you were talking, but I think you addressed a lot of them through the rest of the presentation. So the two I'm going to pull out, I just want to make sure that we cover them. And it was when you were talking about windows. One person asked, are screens a concern? And then another person asked about if like little mini blinds were effective.
So to the first question, and feel free to, I guess, maybe put something in there if I'm thinking about the wrong thing. So you're talking, when you question asker, say screen, I think about just a typical window screen, very fine mesh that you use to keep insects out of your house. Those do not appear to be problematic in any way. If anything, they add visibility. They're not a loose, flowy netting. They're very rigid, so they're not the kind of thing that birds tend to become entrapped in, and they're very visible. So, and the second was about
Mini blinds.
mini blinds. So this is one that is challenging because, again, it's better to try and do something than nothing. And so a lot of times what people will do is they'll turn their blinds so that you have those little slats visible horizontally, almost like the picture we looked at of the retrofit with the building in Portland. The challenge is how the light strikes a window. And so it's constantly going to be changing. It's going to be changing through the day. It's going to be changing seasonally as the sun shifts. And so sometimes those may be very effective, that visual through the glass. And at other times, it may be completely imperceptible from the outside. So the best standard recommendation is if you can get something on the exterior of the glass, on the outside face of the glass, that's usually your best bet for long-term perpetual visibility. But if you have no other options, maybe you're in a place where you're not able to put anything on the exterior of the building window, then even something simple as that, as using those blinds to signal visibility, if it's visible for a few hours, it's better than nothing.
There's one other question from Mohammed. He asks about, are there any agreements between different countries that help with migrating birds? And maybe you might want to answer that, but also touch on some of the things that the flyways are doing.
Sure. So we do have this federal law that is actually a treaty, an international treaty called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And that is basically a protection for non-game bird species. So we have particular rules that govern the take and management of game bird species, but we have all these other birds that are not part of our huntable bird species. And so the Migratory Bird Treaty Act protects native bird species, so not your starlings, not your house sparrows, not your rock pigeons, but anything that's a native bird species is protected under this rule. And it is, as I said, an international treaty with several different countries that we share some of these birds with. And we actually do a lot of work because birds don't perceive borders. They don't perceive glass. They also don't perceive borders. So we're very fortunate to be able to do a lot of work along these flyways. So we share our birds with states to the north. We share our birds with Mexican states to the south, with other countries down into South America, and with our neighbors to the north in Canada. And so we actually have formal groups that actually work. So in the United States, we have flyway councils for the different flyways. So Mississippi, Atlantic, Central, and Pacific. And for us, that includes 10 states in the Central Flyway plus 2 Canadian provinces. And so we actually just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago to talk about shared conservation interests and concerns. And we try to coordinate as much as we can. We also have an initiative that reaches down into the wintering grounds for many of our shared birds called Southern Wings. And so that is a way for states to be able to support conservation work that's happening in the places to the south that host many of the birds that we see here during the breeding season.
Tanya, I had one more question, and I know we have to wrap up here pretty quick with your time. One of the things that I saw a few times in the chat was the response to the information and a want to share it with others. You shared some resources on how our Master Naturalist volunteers can get involved in the research and the surveys. Are there resources that you would direct them to gather education materials that they can then take with the public?
Yes. So again, I would direct you guys to the resources that Audubon Texas has. So they are, as part of this Lights Out Texas, there are things that can be shared on social media. There are even signs that people can put out on their yards. So again, connect with some of those local organizers to perhaps get your hands on some of those. And then in terms of just broad-based education materials and things to really talk about this issue with the public, I would direct people to American Bird Conservancy's resources. They've got an amazing amount of fantastic resources out there on their webpage.
Great. And I think that collective effort to educate others is going to be a great impact of the Master Naturalist army of volunteers that we have.
Well, Tanya, in the essence of time, and we are just a little bit over for our TMN Tuesday, so I wanted to thank you for your presentation today. I hope you get a chance to go and kind of look at some of the comments. There's just, everybody was awestruck by the information you provided, the resources, and the doability of everything that you provided. So thank you. And
we'll see you in October as a speaker at our Master Naturalist annual meeting in McAllen.
Looking forward to it.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you guys, and we'll get the recording for the TMN Tuesday webinar on the website, if not today, first thing tomorrow.